Can we turn it on? Hello, everybody. Hi, places, please. We've got some guests coming in as we close the door. Hello, everybody. I'm Gail Whiteman. I'm now the Hoffman Impact Professor for Accelerating Action on Nature and Climate. I'm also the founder of Arctic Basecamp, which you may have seen up at the Schatzalp. It's a science communication tent. We've been at Davos camping for 9 years to try and bring the message of global risk from climate change to the World Economic Forum. Despite the fact that we've been here for a very long time, I'd have to say that we're in a very strange moment in time. We're certainly at a crossroads. We can see that the crosswinds have changed. We know that the Earth is at 1.5 degrees warmer than it has than what we had was a safe space. We also know extreme weather has climbed dramatically. Given that, you would think that we were doing a lot more action, but we're not. Political will is going in the opposite way. We know today is a very big day for the U.S. administration. We also know, though, that the general public is less convinced of climate action than they were perhaps a few years ago. And what we can see is that also there's a number of companies that are walking out of net zero alliances, which I think is very relevant for where we are here at Davos. So despite that, I think the real question, and maybe the only question, is how do we unleash impact given that context? I have a lot that I can say about that. I'm very happy to say I've got a new team called the Nature and Climate Impact Team, thanks to a very generous donation from Rosalie and Andre Hoffman. But more importantly, I think what we're all here is to listen to the panel and listen to the keynote speaker that we have today to really figure out how are we going to unleash impact, if at all possible, given this context. Who better than to ask my old friend, Peter Bakker, to do opening remarks, keynote speakers. Peter, of course, is president and CEO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD, and the brief I gave to Peter today was Be Unleashed. Welcome.
Which is a silly brief to give a Dutchman. Anyway, here we go. So this is my 25th Davos. And every year I come up this mountain with more trepidation. We've had good years. We've had less good years. And this year we'll see what happens. And that's not because the World Economic Forum doesn't know that sustainability is important, but because it's a microcosmos of the world in which we all operate, and particularly business leaders operate. And, you know, Gail, you rightly said first year that the world hit 1.5 degrees. We're now outside of the safe operating space. Well, we've all seen the fires, the floods, the droughts, and still sustainability in this town is more and more a sideshow. If you want to talk sustainability, you now have to climb up the hill to the Oberstraße. I don't know, does this work or I don't know? It's okay. Can you hear me well? Not so well? You need a microphone?
Can we turn it up, please?
Ta-da, ta-da. I don't know. Oh yeah, this works. The one thing that hasn't changed in Davos is the stink of diesel on the streets. When are we going to just allow electric vehicles in this town? Or just tell everyone to walk? It's ridiculous. And again, that's just a symbol of everything that is wrong. So we're not particularly winning the battle, are we? And I assume you're all here because you believe sustainability is important. If you're not of that mind, you can't really relate to what I say. But we're not particularly winning the battle. Actually, listening to science, we're about to lose the battle. Maybe we've lost it. And that's not to depress each other, but it's really to take a sharp photo of where we are and then have a conversation, what are we going to do? And what are the root causes of all this? It's not emissions. Of course they are, but that's not really the thing. It's a deep, fundamental failing of our economic system, which drives inequality, which drives unhappiness, dissatisfaction in societies, between countries, which leads to fragmentation, to populism, to elections that move in directions that aren't particularly helpful. And that's one element of it. The other element is capital markets continue to be short-term focused. And if you look at all the banks running away from whatever networks of net zero, they're going to continue to be short-term focused. Science isn't cutting through. Now, we've all seen, and I guess most people here will have read, the Planetary Health Check. If you haven't read it, please read it. Came out September, New York. Now, it's beautiful visuals telling a story of complete destruction of our environment, of, not just climate change and emissions and degrees, but the buffer capacity of the planet is now such that that basically the oceans can't absorb emissions enough anymore, and that accelerates the warming, and that causes more trouble. We all know this. Business isn't particularly helping. I run the World Business Council, and I've seen business leaders in the last few weeks turn like a leaf in the wind, trying to please the next person in power or administration in power. So where are the values, the backbone, where we can rely upon, lean against? Not there. And then look at ourselves. It's great to criticize everybody else, but look at the sustainability movement. Just look at the mess we're making of science-based targets and our inability, 8 months after the Financial Times started writing, to fix it. Look at the amount of initiatives, good-willing initiatives that we launch. The audience, businesses and others that need to embrace them are going nuts, don't even know anymore which initiative to support. Actually, this reads like another new one, Nature and Climate Impact Team. I'll make an exception. I'll be leased for 2 seconds. That's a pretty clever idea. Because the one thing, and that's the one big hope, and we have somebody from Brazil here as well, the one big hope for COP30, that will be the first COP where nature and climate will be discussed as one. We need to stop talking about all these things as separate items. So what do we need to do? 2 things. We need to drive solutions at scale. We need to hold people, particularly business leaders, accountable for the progress they're making. There's 5 solutions that we can implement now at scale. Technology is proven, business case exists, no business leader should be allowed not to implement them. Renewable energy, energy efficiency, electrification, methane reduction, and halting deforestation. Those have business cases now. The second thing is there's a number of things we need to do for which the business case needs to be built in the next 3 to 5 years. Regenerative agriculture, circularity, some of those slightly longer term initiatives and solutions that the world needs. Holding people accountable. So that's not about complying with CSRD. As you can tell by my broken English, I'm European. I think Europe is getting it completely wrong with the drive for compliance and penalizing people who don't comply. The IRA has many more benefits and certainly creates a whole lot more excitement for people to make change. So compliance is not the answer, but decision useful information for capital markets is. So not 400 KPIs, but 25. A few years ago, WEF made great inroads in, forgot what they called them, but the 24, I think, indicators they had worked out. Pretty good start of what decision useful information is. Businesses need to absolutely understand physical risk in their supply chains. Business leaders have all suffered badly from the disruptions that COVID put in their supply chains. It took them many years to reset the supply chains and be able to get their products to market. Those same disruptions are on their way now. There's a beverage company, I'll tell it in 2 seconds, $12 billion, revenue, $1.5 billion EBITDA, has done a mapping of all the locations in the world where they grow commodities to make wine and whiskey and whatever else they make. For each location, weather models, climate models, understanding how will the change in weather and climate impact the yield, the production of commodities in each location. What will the lower yield do to commodity prices? What will commodity prices, which will increase, do to the P&L of the business? Base case scenario, 5 years from now, $1.5 billion EBITDA, zero. That's how close risk in supply chains is to business. And there's not a CEO here in Davos who has made the analysis. They're all blind to it. And the wall is getting pretty close. So we need to help them with that, because that will all of a sudden become an economic conversation. Not an ESG or a woke conversation, but I have a big financial risk and I need my capital market to support me to transition faster, to invest in resilience. And the thing that will connect the solutions to the accountability are not ESG reports, but are the transition plans. We need every business to create a standardized, comparable transition plan that shows how much they're investing into the solutions that we know work, how much progress they're making in decarbonizing their supply chains, how well they're able to manage the risks in those supply chains. And we, the conscious people in Davos, and I'm glad there's still quite a few of you here, we need to not complain, and that's a mistake, and we'll talk about it on the panel. We shouldn't complain about backtracking of business against prior commitments. I've been in rooms like this for many years in Davos, and I've seen the Paul Polmans and others of this world making these grandiose promises. And those promises sounded great then and were precisely what we needed in that era, but they're not deliverable. We need to hold business accountable for what they deliver, not for what they promise. And the only way to do that is by creating transition plans. It's one thing to unleash a voice, but the next thing you should then ask them, and what are you doing, Peter? Which is fair enough. And then I'll tell you what WEF should do, which is, I admit, I'm the last person in Davos the WEF will take advice from, but I'll give it anyway. So we, World Business Council, 250 large companies, membership. These companies combined emit more, well more, than 20% of all emissions in the world. We work on nature action, equity action, climate action, on food system transformation, on built environment, on I don't know what all we work on. I now have board approval. We're only going to work on two things. How do we accelerate the decarbonization to bring it in line with what science tells us is needed? And the second thing is, how do we get capital markets to reward those efforts? That's all we're going to do. What does WEF need to do? Again, with all modesty and understanding nobody will record or share it with them, WEF needs to put membership criteria on all of those that come to Davos. We've done it 5 years ago. We lost, 10, 12 companies that said, oop, it's a bit tough. We ratchet those criteria up each year. We give them scorecards. If they do not adhere, they have 6 months to present an action plan on how they're going to align with the criteria. That's the discipline that if people voluntarily want to be part of the World Business Council or voluntarily want to come to Davos, we should impose upon them. If you do not have a transition plan that embraces this, you're not welcome in Davos. That's a simple measure that the WEF could do, will cost them 20% of their membership. That's the price to pay. Thank you.
Micah, and thank you, Peter. Excellent comments. I want you to stay on stage. Nick Gowing, former BBC anchor and author of Thinking the Unthinkable, is going to take over from me now, and he's going to ask you a question.
Afternoon, everybody. Peter, are you being a bit restrained? You've used some pretty blunt language, which is actually things are going very badly, and the issue here is about communication as much as anything else. And in the next 45 minutes, what I want to do is hear from you, as well as from Peter and some of the panelists as well, about what big ideas there are, but how bold can we be? Let me put to you, and I'm an old hand of the WEF, I haven't had a white badge for many years. I don't believe that the forum is prepared to do what you've just said.
No, that's probably why I said I'm the worst advisor to the WEF. But we need to, you know, okay, I'll tell you another story. My previous session, the Pope, and I'm not a religious man, apologies if that's the implication of those words, has said the world needs to change. It's not right that there is a summer palace for the Pope exclusively for 2 or 3 weeks for him to rest over summer. So he's going to open it up. He's not just going to open it up, he's going to turn it into the most sustainable place on earth. It's 55 hectares, it's massive, bigger than Vatican itself. It will be opened up, it's being opened up. They're going to create an educational center in there, experiential, whatever, learning, both for refugees, for all kind of people, but also executive learning. Maybe we should take the sustainability conversations there. Because here, if you're the CEO, and this is no blame to the CEO, but the amount of pressures that are on CEOs today to deal with AI, with geopolitics, with economics, whatever, all the stuff that is going on here makes it very hard to sit in this room and think, I'm gonna, yeah.
But it's also from shareholders who want a better return.
Yeah, but you know, we need to, the shareholders are blind to the risks that they're exposed to. If this case of the beverage company was understood, and this company could do it because it was a non-listed company, but if it's understood by capital markets that 5 to 10 years from now your profit will be gone as a result of disruptions in your supply chain, capital market would sing another tune. Individuals, companies can't do that because that will tank their share price and make their competitors laugh. But sector analysis can be made and should be driven in. And then we can say, okay, if you're in the beverage industry in a particular part of the world, this is your risk profile.
Just before we move on, do you fear that actually the battle is being lost, has been lost, and in fact the kind of discussion we're having here is really a marginalization of where the problem is and what needs to be done? In other words, everyone in this kind of area is now being pushed into a sidebar.
Yeah, but I don't think that's because the battle is lost. When I say the battle is lost is, you know, up until last year actually, here or in any of the climate COPs, the song was 1.5 alive. Everybody who went said, yeah, 1.5 alive. Well, Johan Rockström, Planetary Health Check, September, New York, 1.5 is dead. We're going to crash through 1.5. We're going to go 1.8 to 2.7 degrees Celsius. Apologies for the Americans. We're going to overshoot. Then we need to keep maximum pressure on decarbonization to push ourselves back under 1.5 in the next 2 to 3 decades. And hope, and that's the word, hope, that the natural tipping points won't tip in those 3 decades. This is not me making it up. This is almost literal what Johan says when he speaks about the planetary health check. So from that point of view, we have lost the 1.5 battle. But we cannot give up on getting back under 1.5 as soon as we can. But whether or not tipping points tip, whether or not, you know, the fires or the floods or the whatever are just the beginning, I don't think anybody knows.
Well, let's see where we get to by 6 o'clock. We've set a very, very tight deadline. Let me, Peter, take a seat wherever you'd like to take a seat. I'd like to bring you in as well at some point, but let me introduce James Grecian, who is going to join us, who is polar scientist in residence at Arctic Basecamp. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm going to start by saying the world's on fire. 2024 was the hottest year on record. As we've just heard, 1.5 degrees centigrade was breached. And we've all either seen or felt and experienced extreme weather events. Now, the poles, our polar regions, are ground zero for climate change. And I thought I would use this platform as an opportunity to share 2 stories with you, 2 observations that or experiences that I've had as a polar scientist over the last few years. So this is a harp seal, and I was lucky enough to study them for a few years, and you may have seen some of our work on Frozen Planet 2, the BBC documentary that was aired 2 years ago. In my lifetime, we've lost 40% of the Arctic summer sea ice. Now, that change doesn't amplify just the risk for us. That's a loss of critical habitat for animals at our poles, including these harp seals. The way that the ice melts over the course of a summer in a typical year fuels productivity, drives spring blooms, and large populations of animals travel from all over the planet to eat and forage in those areas. So we travel to go and tag these animals and understand their migration. And now, at the end of the winter, the sea ice forms up, and the seals use that to haul out and give birth. And what we see is that over the last several decades, that ice is forming up later, it's melting earlier, and so the window that the seals have to breed is reduced. What that means is the pups get born, the pups try to start learning to swim, but before they can, the ice disappears and they drown. Those conditions are only going to get worse, and we don't know what the fate of harp seals is. The second story is from my work in Antarctica. So I've spent the last 2 winters down in Antarctica in the mountains of central Johnning Moorland. So that's 200 kilometers in from the edge of the ice in a large mountain range of nunataks. Now, we're there to study the petrels that breed on the mountains. But in the year before my first expedition, there was some extremely warm weather that was really unusual for Antarctic summer. And that brought with it large amounts of snow. The snow covered the breeding colony, and when the scientists that were there went out to go and do their surveys of these Antarctic petrels, they found 3 breeding birds. That colony should host between 20 and 200,000 breeding birds. Those extreme environmental effects and climate effects that we're seeing don't just impact us, they impact our nature too. And there's a glacier that runs along the bottom of the colony. And when you stand on it, it's very strange to realize that you're standing on a kilometer deep layer of ice. Now, to give you an idea of what that is if we stand here in Davos and we look at the mountains that are around us, those mountains are a kilometer above us. So that's how much volume of ice we're talking about in Svartamaran where these birds breed. But in Antarctica on the whole, the average ice depth is 2 kilometers. And that ice is melting. And that melting is occurring faster and faster. The UN has declared 2025 as the International Year of Glacier Preservation. Antarctica holds 91% of all our glaciers. Now, I can talk about this and you can say, oh, look, the man came and he told us about these beautiful birds and he was concerned. But what I'll point out is that a recent World Economic Forum report stated that by the end of this century, 410 million people will be displaced by sea level rise. So I'll finish with a table many of you will have seen from the recent World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. Polar change is going to turbocharge all of the risks that we've seen. If you look at the 2-year horizon on the left and then the 10-year horizon on the right, those top 4 are all green. They're all environmental impacts, and they're all going to be accelerated by climate change. And as we just heard, the climate change crisis goes hand in hand with our biodiversity crisis. We rely on nature to help us address many of these climate change impacts. Half of global GDP depends on nature. But despite our commitments of the past, we're failing to meet them. We're failing to meet the HE biodiversity targets. Maybe it's not all bad news. Paris was a 20-year average. So I started by saying that we've blasted through 1.5 degrees, but we need to break Paris an average of 20 years of over 1.5 degrees. But every 1/10 of a degree that we increase and accelerate our warming brings greater risk for all of us.
Thanks, James. Okay, good. Let me invite, we want to keep this going, the next generation. Let me invite Storm and Camilla up. And while you're coming up, let me just tell you, where I live in southwest London, that we have people living in our street who have no clue about global warming until they suddenly had floods, which flooded their basements, and now they realize they can't get insurance for it. And suddenly the polar bear on an ice floe is relevant to them because they realize it's affecting them. So that's why what you've just said is really important. Secondly, if I may, the planetary health check, which Peter talked about, I have it in front of me, and Johan Rockström talks about the need for communication, much sharper communication, making it understood, the kind of things we're talking about. And that's what we're going to try and talk to about with Katie, about how to communicate this with the public who don't understand what sustainability is. But first of all, let me introduce Storm and Kamila from Arctic Basecamp Youth Ambassadors.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Storm Lewis, and I'm a climate science ambassador with the Arctic Basecamp team. And I'd first like to just thank Arctic Basecamp for and the WWF UK team for providing the support for me to be here and have this platform to speak to you all today. And I founded the consulting firm Storm Indigo L Consulting, LLC, and I did that to provide support and research, data-driven research to environmental organizations, and also provide governance support and strategic support around participatory grant-making practices. I also serve on the board of directors of the Hitchcock Center for the Environment, and they're one of the few buildings that's a living building in the world. So my background, and I'll give a little bit about my history. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I had a strong affinity for gardening. And I had a vermiculture and composting in my school yard in elementary school. And over the years, I started to understand the key role that diet plays in community health, given the history of breast cancer in my family. So I went on to Smith College, and I went on to the Yale School of the Environment to study food sovereignty and really understand how community autonomy can be achieved for Black communities through owning the means of production across the food supply chain. So understanding how to own the production of food, the transportation of food, the distribution, so where food is purchased, along with the environmental education, opportunities for Black farmers, and especially owning the means of financial institutions that are supporting Black farmers. And really, it's important to think about food systems from a US lens for Black farmers, given the history of racial discrimination, predatory lending, heirs property laws, and the Jim Crow era that has led to a major amount of land loss amongst Black farmers. And so there are estimates and studies that indicate that based on those losses, there is a potential of $326 billion of potential economic development that was lost given that history. So when we think about the government's role in food systems, it's really important to think about how food sovereignty is really a pathway to maintain resilience in spite of the political state. And so what we see here with the election of President Trump, there is a direct threat to climate action work being done, and government agencies that I work with are really scared about the potential cutbacks. And the call to action that I have is to have organizations think about not just funding climate smart agriculture for Black communities, but giving roles that are in key decision-making processes at the executive level and supporting individuals, for instance, on board placements once they get there so that they feel comfortable to be there. And President Trump will be here for 4 years, but the planet will be here far longer than that. And we cannot take 4 years of environmental setbacks. Thank you.
Thank you, Storm.
Let me just add, if I may, so in the next half hour, what we're really looking for is big ideas from you, the kind of things which maybe even us on the platform are not yet thinking about. Go ahead.
My name is Camilo, and I grew up in the outskirts neighbors of São Paulo city, surrounded by very systemic inequalities that shapes my understanding what is climate, resilience, and collective power. Over the past decade, I've been working alongside Amazonian communities, trying to build systemic solutions from their perspective and get their voices amplified in rooms like this where they are now invited. We are at a critical moment in our history, and the planet is what at risk. The planet will be fine. Is our existence that is at risk. But our humanity survival depends on the choices that we make today. The question isn't if we need to do something that is necessary, is whether you're going to do, and if you are deciding on lead to that. or we're going to be accept that we will be left behind. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to the crisis that we face today. The answers are not linear because the problem are not. That's why I urge you and to all of us to embrace bold action, not from a place of fear and scarcity, but a place of love and abundance. Half of the global GDP, $44 trillion, depends on nature. The other ones, most of the people are expending in fossil fuels. Yet are destroying the very ecosystems we need to survive. Meanwhile, indigenous people who protect 80% of global biodiversity are excluded from the decisions while their lands are exploited. This is a moral failure and a massive missed opportunity for all of us. Let me be clear, the era of fossil fuels, it's over, and each of you in this room has a role on this. Stop funding destruction and start investing in renewable energy and regenerative economies. The science is clear, the time is now. We don't have a chance to, just one more year of profit. That's not sustainable. Real leadership means protecting biodiversity, empowering indigenous communities, and embedding sustainability in our supply chains. Not as a PR strategy or exercise, but it's actually action. You have the power, resources, and influence to drive a just transition that prioritizes equity and action. Choose courage now over complacency. Act boldly now, because history will judge each of us. The planet will thrive without us, but our future depends on what we choose today. Thank you.
Storm and Camila, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Let me invite Katie, yes please. Let me invite Katie and Eliane up here, because we want to talk now about the kind of language we're using, the kind of impact that we can have, the kind of urgency that is achievable, building on what Peter was saying earlier, and he's used some pretty respectable words as opposed to the kind of things I've heard a lot of people say, which is not just we're losing the battle, and they've used some pretty unpleasant words to say we're actually in danger of screwing up very significantly. But let me go to Katie first, because Katie, you are working for M&C Saatchi, which are in the business of PR and communication.
Communications in the whole, but for global social issues.
And I need to just say that Johan Rockström in the intro to the Planetary Health Check launched, which as Peter said was in New York back in September, says we've got to know how to communicate this because people don't understand what we're talking about. What about the words we're using?
So I think it's amazing to me that we've taken an issue that has unimaginable potential impact that's going to happen to humans, to nature, society, economies, and we've managed to create a lexicon that is incredibly boring and has stripped out all the emotion in the issue. I think we've created a language that makes it easier to be siloed. Whether you look at language like sustainability, ESG, etc., I think if we were thinking about the opposition, they would never create language that was so exclusive that meant it didn't feel like an inclusive club to be about. So the example I always give is in the US with the Republicans. They wanted to increase opposition to their state tax. So what did they do? They looked for an automotive word that could bring loads of associations. They changed the estate tax to the death tax, 10% swing in opposition. We're not creating those microscripts really, or positioning it in values or benefits, and it's not reflecting the modern landscape of communications. If you look at whether it's Take Back Control or Make America Great Again, there was value-led platforms, and then beyond that, messaging that appealed to very different interests, depending on what you cared about, whether it's saving animals, whether it's better jobs for the economy, and I just don't feel like we're taking advantage of some of the opportunities to reframe the issue.
So if we don't understand what sustainability is, or the average person out there who's either being fried or is being flooded or is being frozen or is living in very difficult conditions, and they don't understand what we're talking about, what is being said in something like the SDG tent, what kind of language will they understand which will help mobilize and put pressure on the politicians to do things which are necessary at speed?
So I also think there's even a question to ask, which is how much do people need to understand sustainability to do the actions that we require of them? So
they understand if they're being flooded, or
yes, but a great example for me would be at the moment, clean jobs in America are rising at twice the rate of US employment, and one of the biggest states benefiting is Texas. With my comms lens on, I would create advertising of a weather-worn, masculine Texas man with a denim jacket and an American flag on the background saying "American-made energy," and I would make it feel values-led and get people to buy in for their reasons rather than trying to get people to buy in for the reasons we want them to buy in. And I think that's a really crucial difference.
What about the issue of public health? We're all going to be badly affected by the fact, as we saw in Dubai, the temperature going up to 62 degrees. Rain twice in 3 weeks, up to 10 feet deep. And we had in the United Kingdom a broadcast scientist, Michael Mosley, who went out for a walk in Greece. He should have known better. It was 41 degrees. It killed him.
I think that's another interesting issue. Again, I think we're creating language around that issue that's creating silos. So I hear people talking about the climate and health nexus, taking two baggy words that are hard to understand and putting them together and trying to make it appealing. Whereas actually talking about infectious disease, talking about breathing, trying to position it in things that people can tangibly picture in their heads. I think that's where we've got to go to try and find those ins to get emotion and rational messaging.
So how could you, as a communications expert, unleash impact in a way which is not being unleashed at the moment?
So the thing I would like to see, I often see messaging research, but I see it as starting with quite technical messaging and then asking people what ones they prefer. I think looking at messaging from a very values-led, auto-emotive sort of perspective to be a public good for the community, to work out what language resonates best, to get broad partisan support. And I would also look at unusual suspects, because a lot of change doesn't just happen by the message. It's a sense that unlikely suspects are joining others, and that's been shown throughout history. At the moment, we don't have the unlikely suspects on the stage with the likely suspects to go, oh, right, there's momentum. This has got beyond the echo chamber. So I think we need to think about protagonists as well.
Let's move to World Agroforestry. Welcome, Eliane. You are Chief Executive Officer and Director General of World Agroforestry. What's your reflection on what you've been hearing about how this is communicated, how it is unleashed?
So I totally agree in terms of how do we get energy in motion in terms of how we're communicating. And so how we're telling the story is as important as the science behind the story. And so
Do you think it should be told as a story, do you?
It has to be. So what we do in terms of our organization is we have the Global Landscape Forum, which is a platform where we bring young people, indigenous people, women, we bring people from all over the world at the interface of art and science to really share in ways that energize communities. And we have restoration champions that are young people in their communities who are doing things, and we help them move forward with their own programs in their communities in ways that they know how to communicate locally. And so that what we see is really critical, is connection on the ground so that the work we're doing has a way of being communicated so people understand it at their level and how they're being affected by it. And for me, being based in Nairobi, where we had about 3 years of drought and then massive floods that killed people and destroyed infrastructure, what's interesting for me is there's a sense of understanding that they're being affected, whether it's the insurance companies, the bankers, the farmers. And so those dialogues are happening where people are understanding that they're being affected and they want to be part of the change that brings forward the transformation and the transition needed. And so being so close to the vulnerabilities that are happening and consequences that are happening one after the other has really created a sense of momentum that I see our work is helping scale.
I'm going to use another big word now, vocabulary.
Yes.
How much does vocabulary matter? In other words, making it simple, as we just heard from Katie.
So what I say is, if you can't give an elevator pitch to a minister of finance on whatever scientific thing you're doing, you're not going to get anywhere. And so I say, how do you communicate it? So whether it's a minister of finance, whether it's a 5-year-old, your baker, or your hairdresser, how can they understand whatever you're doing? Yes, you can have be publishing in high factor journals and talking in the vocabulary that people, your peers understand. But if we're really going to have to scale this work, we have to ensure that we're translating it. And so we're working, for example, right now, with a documentary filmmaker to look at how are we looking at agroforestry around the world. And so that's going to come up in Netflix in a year or two. But we're looking at how do we make those unusual partnerships to make sure that our work, we work with chefs in terms of how do we look at local biodiversity and food and make it delicious to look at biodiversity. And so those partnerships are really critical if we're going to scale and get beyond the people who are in this room to really ensure that we bring everybody forward.
Gail, come up and join us, because your title, your new title at Exeter University, and I'm going to quote it here, is Accelerating Action on Nature and Climate. There aren't many universities which would have a title like that, Accelerating Action on Nature and Climate. I mean, what's your reflection on what you've heard about the enormity of the challenge, but also the urgency of what needs to be done and whether it is achievable?
Well, I think there's no question that we're losing the battle. And I think we're not just losing the battle in terms of CO2 emissions, which continue to climb. We're losing the battle in terms of language, narrative, and hearts and minds, quite frankly. If I take a look as a social scientist here who spent probably almost my entire career trying to translate natural science, which sounds like gobbledygook most of the time, into narratives that business understands, but consumers understand and citizens understand. I mean, we just need to actually do a hell of a lot more, and we need to rapidly learn and partner with each other. So some of the stuff we did with Arctic Basecamp was really to try and get the message of global risk from a polar change into the forum. I think we've done that quite a lot, but what's interesting, I think, picking up what Ileana said about Nairobi, is that we've also created an online platform speaking to citizens in vulnerable countries, and for a science website, we've had 4 million hits coming in from all around the world, over 50% from the African continent. Then we've got Asia and Latin America. And why? Well, because we actually talk about things that they matter. Now, in those regions, in those countries around the world, they're worried about the global risks, the extreme weather they're already experiencing. But there's this understanding in climate communications, you can't talk doom and gloom. You have to always talk win-win and the opportunities.
It can be done positively.
Well, it's not necessarily. I mean, I think it really depends on the target audience. When you're actually in the middle of a flood or you're in the middle of a famine, you don't want the win-win fairy tale. You want the actual reality of saying, what the fuck is happening and how can we get out of this alive? And I think, and I say that honestly, because I think the idea that we have to always package things in some sort of sanitized way just does not make sense to me. Now, spoiler alert, I actually started off before I became a scientist in marketing and advertising, and target audience stuff is what is important. And if we don't actually say authentic things like I just did by swearing, people do not listen to you. Now, they can be happy stories if that is the lens in which that target audience wants to see and hear and feel and do. But in other lenses, it's different. And I think that's what science needs to do. We're losing the battle on climate misinformation. People out there don't call it misinformation. They don't call it climate misinformation. They actually call it facts now. They're not facts. They're not evidence. And this is where the tech companies need to at least become more responsible, or certainly help us as scientists get our messages out there, because we're losing the battle. We don't have the money, we don't have the know-how, and we don't have the airwaves.
The trouble is the planetary health check is dismissed as fake news.
Well, I don't think most citizens are even reading Planetary Health Check.
Of course not.
Right? They're not.
No.
So that's not to their target audience. What they're actually talking about is my kids. They're talking about my pets.
Well,
right?
How do we relate? How do we relate to the kids and the people like Michael Mosley and those who are planting their seeds and their plants at 3 o'clock in the morning in India, because that's the coolest time of the day, but it still kills them?
So then my question, that goes to Katie, but also Peter. So Katie understands what consumers are thinking about, citizens, but Peter understands what business is talking and thinking about. So I think it's got to actually work with that. Like, how do you get all the message, the science that Johan has, I have, James has, et cetera, and actually move the audiences that you know so well?
Peter, if there was a major movement, a citizens' assembly, a ground force upwards, would that make a significant difference, even if the companies are more worried about shareholder returns?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, at the end of the day, business has a couple of stakeholders that they respond to, and consumer demand is absolutely up in the top. So if there's a massive mobilization in citizens in a language that will make clear that consumer behavior is going to be the solution or the driver of solutions, that will wake up any CEO.
Any CEO,
Well, yeah, most all of them.
even if the pension funds want higher returns.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, the super interesting model at the moment to all study is the automotive industry. Because there the from to is super clear, stop combustion, go electric. The transition is super difficult because all of us are scared to buy an electric vehicle because once a year we want to go on a long distance holiday and how the hell do we charge? So we don't buy these cars. Insurance companies ask more money for the premium because the damage is bigger, and CEOs are getting nervous. Then the geopolitics turns around. China becomes the enemy. Now we're slapping tariffs. I'm going to lose my Chinese business. I'm not going to move anymore. I'm going to backtrack. But the solution is the right solution. We all need to buy this, and we don't because of relatively selfish issues. But if it was packaged, if you buy an electric vehicle, you're actually avoiding the fires in LA or whatever the language is. And if enough people buy into that narrative, then people will say, we need to continue to invest.
In addition to Gail's title of her professional standing at Exeter University, I remind you, we're trying to work out how to unleash impact. How do we turbocharge action? Who's got some ideas from the floor? Anyone, please, let me come and bring a microphone to you. Tell us who you are.
Thank you, Nick. I'm a big fan of yours first. But my name is Fernando Morales de la Cruz. I'm a journalist who has been investigating misery, hunger, malnutrition in supply chains for 10 years. And I'm deeply concerned because 54 years after the WEF was created, there are at least 75 million children working in the supply chains of 2,500 WEF participants. And this is absolutely unacceptable. But worse, we have many corporations that have actually increased misery, hunger, malnutrition with fake development aid programs like fair trade. Exeter is a fair trade university, and they pay the coffee growers half of what they earned 40 years ago. We can't continue like this. So the solution is quite simple: change of business model. Because this is a group of business people, if we had 10 cents per cup of coffee or tea, we could actually change it. But we have to have enough money to solve the problems on the ground with the people. Have sustainable agriculture, protecting the environment. It costs money. But if we pay 4 francs for a cup of coffee here, and we only send 1% to Kenya, Guatemala, Brazil, we can't expect them to protect the environment or even protect their children. Thank you.
Peter, just a quick question. Do they want to change their model or not, business? You're the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. How many members do you have?
250. No, our biggest work program is corporate performance and accountability. And that talks all about what is a better decision, what is the data you need, and what is a business model that will include externalities. So yeah, there's a willingness, but it takes two to tango, and the financial markets at the moment are not easy to engage with.
Okay, next one.
Aloha, everybody. Amanda Ellis from the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Lab. And I want to come at this from the position of incentives. So I live in Hawaii, hence the aloha, and we actually incentivize the shift to renewable energy and to electric vehicles. One of the big things that we're working on with Parliaments for the Planet, with the Interparliamentary Union, is making sure that parliamentarians actually understand the linkages you just spoke about, Peter. And sorry, I got lost, so I'm late, everybody else. But I think if we can also ensure that politicians are setting the right frameworks for business to succeed so they're not seeing these flip-flops, we know already renewables are so much cheaper.
But what about public pressure? Public pressure on the politicians?
Absolutely. That was the other key thing that the Interparliamentary Union said to me on Friday. We have to be educating their constituents. So we as a university are now partnering with Foreign Press Correspondents Association and journalists to try to counter the disinformation. But it's a big challenge. It's a really important thing to do, to have constituencies understanding the links between science, as Gail is trying to show, and the fires in LA. We
Katie,
need people to understand.
Do you think that good journalism, getting it on the main news broadcast on linear channels, is really a way forward to get that kind of momentum that we're trying to talk about here, to unleash impact?
I think it's a mix of coming at it from all different angles. I'm thinking recently in the UK, for example, some of you may have heard of the post office scandal. There had been articles about it for a long time. It wasn't getting political traction. Suddenly there was a sort of soap drama about the families, and the pressure on the government increased to such a degree that they had to take action. So it feels to me there's all the pieces of the puzzle speaking together and making sure there's collaboration across those pieces to hit the investigative journalism, to hit the emotions that we're getting. And also, I still think that the language is so important. So, ESG versus talking about things like value chain stability, like thinking about words like stability, safety. There's ways of having emotive language that actually resonates across business and consumers as well.
We look forward to seeing your new dictionary. Next question. Next thought.
So my name is Minu Ratnasbapathi. I'm a senior researcher at MIT, working specifically with climate data and unlocking this wealth of data that we have into storytelling and narrative, into a hopeful message. And what I really haven't heard from this panel is the talk about timescales. So often businesses and governments and even the SDGs are talking about 2030 or 2050. And quite honestly, 2030 is too late. So very curious as to how the narrative is changing, how businesses are responding to this very imminent timescale that we need to act on.
And what's your thought about storytelling?
So I work specifically with satellite Earth observation data. We have 100 terabytes of data on our planet every single day, and it's about translating that. We call it a hyper-local impact, right? People care about their backyards. So it's about translating and demystifying, quite honestly, data into something that is contextual for people that they understand.
And building on what Katie said, do you believe that's possible?
I do think that's why I have a job. So yes, we need to keep doing that, but make it.
Yeah, but I think we have to translate that data. So I love data too, and I think one of the good examples is air pollution, the apps that came out of Beijing to actually show to people that were living there what their health risks were. So how do you take data that's hyper local but make it relevant to me, or to you, or to you, or to you? And I think that's the opportunity here. And I think from a timescale perspective, I think that's going to be tricky. I mean, people are notoriously bad at quitting smoking when they're 25 because they're going to get, heart disease when they're 50. It's a lot easier when you're around the corner from those age groups than it is to begin with. So humans are not good with that. So we have to somehow make that long-term relevant to me and you now.
And that means the word accessible.
Accessible.
It's got to be accessible and understandable. Let me go to another. Got a lot of people who want to talk. Come in, please.
So I'm Hanan. I'm the CEO of Black Power, and I love what you mentioned there. So we finance the green transition, and I think changing the communication when we go to large institutions like banks, that's what we do. And they put solar farms in Texas not because they're environmentally friendly, it's because they make money in Texas. So if we double tap on that and really show how creating an infrastructure that's green, that's better for the environment, is actually profitable for the banks, for the financial institutions, and create that communication. Don't bring up SDGs, don't bring up ESG, bring up, we're gonna make you money. And then focus on that aspect and create the mechanism with the incentives, with whatever is available. And that's the way, at least we have had success selling it to Wall Street. And that's what they're there to make. Shareholder value. That the financial institutions are what's gonna move the infrastructure forward, in my opinion. So communicating that and making sure that we're not fighting against this administration with buzzwords that have not worked, right? But with the buzzwords that have been working for since financial institutions have been around.
Just to add on that, one of the things that's really critical when I talk about greening infrastructure, it's when you have infrastructure and you have climate events, everything gets destroyed unless you have greened the infrastructure so it stays resilient. So when I have conversations in Kenya, we know that a lot of infrastructure was destroyed in May. And what we talk about is how do we make sure that the long-term investments governments, corporations are making will not be damaged because that planning for the greening of the infrastructure isn't incorporated. Because you continue to pay for the infrastructure that was destroyed, because you had long-term loans. So why not make those loans smart and ensure that that greening happens in the planning so that those investments only happen once and you're not continuously getting loans for infrastructure because you're getting them destroyed in the process because you haven't thought about greening. And so how we look at that as sustainable and profitable is really critical.
If you've got a big idea, you've got 5 minutes to put it on the agenda. We want to hear it. Anyone want to come in? You do.
Yes. Hi, my name is Allison Pobrislow, and I'm working in decarbonization and tourism and also communication to connect the affluent demographic to climate action with all the stakeholders. So creating a pathway where they can understand what is the carbon footprint of the tourism demographic and connecting them and giving them a pathway to actually contribute and participate and donate to environmental partners. So it's really, again, demystifying, but what's critical, so you're reaching a small portion. I think Tesla did this effectively. But what's important is as soon as it becomes economically interesting and viable for corporations, then climate change will be solved. And climate change has a marketing problem.
But it won't be solved, Allison. It won't be solved. That's the whole point. What's locked already into the system from a scientific perspective, and the analysis
We're too
shows
far.
that it won't be. It won't be actually. So I think that we can't have false narrative on that. And I think what we need to do is build adaptive capacity, because if we take a look at things like Greenland, 27 centimeters are baked in right now, even if we stopped all emissions in terms of sea level rise this century. There's not a single coastal city in the world, of which they are big cities, that is ready for that this century. So the idea that climate change will be solved is not the case. It's about how are we going to adapt smart, given the train wreck that's coming down the path.
Economic incentives.
One more thought here.
Hi, Celia Chouquet. I'm the co-chair of the Climate Health Initiative for Catalyst Now, which is a web initiative bringing together over 5,000 social entrepreneurs in the world with a reach of 2 billion people, most of which are the most vulnerable population to climate change. I think we need to put the impact that climate change has on human health front and center, and the impact it's having right now on everybody. And it's not just a global south problem, that this is happening in the global north. People are drowning from floods in Europe. They are being impacted by wildfires in the US. We should have a tracker like we had for COVID, showing all of the death that climate change is causing right now. People started putting their mask on with COVID because it was impacting their health and the health of their loved ones. This is already happening. I don't know why we're not making it more prominent in this narrative.
I would certainly offer the personal view that that is crucial in all of this. The World Meteorological Organization said to me very clearly, we know vast numbers of people are dying from heat, but we don't know who they are because they're unrecorded. Two more quick interventions here.
Thank you. I feel like we're powerful people here, and I feel the sight goes outward. And for me, the solution is going inward. And I've heard the words love and hearts. And my thesis is that the issue is that the self-love is missing. I think many problems are getting solutions, consumption, in order to fill a hole that's in our body, that's in our psyche. And if we can find that love for ourselves, get clear on our values, our bodies will tell. And from there, that's going to ripple out. Thank you.
Heart and earth have the same letters.
Hi, my name is Kirsten. I study the behavioral science around courage in leaders, and I do agree on the language point a lot, but I do think that that's the outer layer, and many leaders I work with from bigger organizations really want to make the step, but in the crucial decision making, they can't justify it for themselves. So by working one-on-one, and it can be at scale using AI technologies, really to make that steps to boldness, and we know there are 11 factors driving your courage as a person. So I would love to make the case that we go beyond language and really get into the social science, also about group dynamics, and really that's not a complex thing to do. It's really, it can be like if Peter would have a one-on-one with the CEO, apply some of these psychological techniques, you can convert people simply, and then it's honest, right? And it's not a fake story. Then it's really a CEO who stands up, and all other groups, right? Because everyone is important here. And we can do that at scale through AI. So broaden the scope beyond language to the other social sciences as well, and make it tangible solutions that can scale through technology. And if you want to partner, go to me.
I think I love that point for going beyond language, but also what you said about group dynamics, because one of the big conflicts I have to come in events like this is how do we create a space for more than the people that are already on our side? And that is one of the most difficult things. And often that involves bringing people into the room that might have different values, might be in it for different reasons, as you said. And I don't think as a community we're very good at creating inclusive places where other people feel welcome if they don't have the similar views.
Peter, can I just check? Do you try and convert your chief executives who are members of the WBCSD? How do the conversations go?
Oh, well, it depends on the person. I mean, I have to say courage has come down in recent years. You know, a couple of years ago, if you were here in this particular tent, Paul Polman, Feike Siebesma, if I now look in who's the leader of the world in terms of CEOs, the answer is Jesper Brodin. Well, he's a privately owned company with a very deep integration of sustainability. Who's the leading CEO or group of CEOs from listed companies that are willing to make bold statements? They're not here anymore. So individually, when it's not recorded, there's not an audience in the room, you can have really good conversations, which are much more than a few years ago how difficult it is. But you have the conversation, but the courage is not growing.
Final thought, and then Gail, if you'd like to wrap up. Maybe take one question in a moment. Let me put to you, CSOs, Chief Sustainability Officers, are no longer fashionable. The HSBC CSO has just resigned. The CSO of Unilever is now Joint Corporate Affairs Officer as well. Now, we're seeing a trend which is to shove the CSO to the back of the office or get rid of them.
Yeah, but that I'm not worried about. That's the same as complaining that commitments are being withdrawn. If we really want to scale sustainability or climate action, we need to have the procurement officers, we have the engineers, we have the product developers. It's not the CSO that is going to make the shift in the company. It needs to be deeply integrated into business. So I don't think it's totally true, by the way, but even if it is true, it's not my biggest worry.
One final thought and then Gail.
I, just because AI was mentioned, would love to get the panel's thoughts really on whether we should be talking about AI without considering its enormous heat emissions and water use. I know the UK government has just announced a huge plan to adopt AI, and personally I found it really disappointing that there was no mitigating plans being put in place in terms of the emissions. And we know it can be done because there's a project in Stockholm that utilises the heat emissions to heat an apartment complex. Why are more governments not doing this, and what can we do to make people understand the real impact of it?
Take public pressure.
It will take a combination of public pressure and elevating the ones who are doing good. Because there are companies who are doing AI and who are trying to figure out where should they put their data centers to take advantage of energy in terms of how they're building their data centers. And so part of it is we need to scale and amplify the good ways it's done, and we need to put pressure for regulation around where those data centers are and why they're there. And so linking those two is a really critical one.
Nick, I think we're over time, and I know that Peter's got another meeting, so I think we're going to, I'm just going to have to wrap up. I know that there's more questions, and that actually is a good thing.
Have we unleashed impact?
No, I don't think we have, but I think what we have is unleashed interest in unleashing impact, which is the precursor. I guess what I'd like to just say to everyone in the audience is that if your word or phrase for the year is not unleashing impact, then what are you doing? And I say that to myself, and I say that to the rest. So if you've got ideas, please come and talk to me and my team. And I just think that we need to see each other a whole lot more. And thank everybody, and thank you, Nick.
My pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.